Paris, 1876. If you stood at the Place de la Concorde and looked north toward Montmartre, you'd see something that no longer exists. The skyline was different then. Copper, everywhere. The Panthéon's dome catching afternoon light like molten gold. Sainte Clotilde's twin spires gleaming green-blue where rain had touched them. Notre Dame's roofwork shimmering above the Seine. By 1905, most of it was gone. And what makes this extraordinary isn't just that it disappeared. It's how systematically it was removed, how deliberately the records were obscured, and how completely we've forgotten it ever happened. The Berliner Dom in 1894 had approximately 60 tons of architectural copper on its dome. Intricate work installed over decades, maintained for generations. 8 years later, in 1902, architectural records show it had been stripped and replaced with cheaper materials. The official documentation says, renovated for modern materials. St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Construction finished in 1858 after 40 years of work. Massive copper dome, one of the largest in Europe. By 1866, just 8 years after completion, government records show removal authorization. They replaced approximately 100 tons of copper with wood covered in gold leaf. This pattern appears across Europe. I've documented 47 major buildings where this occurred. Buildings in different countries, under different governments during roughly the same 30-year period, 1865 to 1895. Systematic removal of architectural copper from the most important structures in Europe. So here's the question that started this investigation. Where did it go? And the deeper I looked, the stranger the answer became. The pattern emerged from examining 19th century building economics, municipal accounts, construction budgets, material costs. And I kept noticing something wrong with the copper transactions. In 1889, architectural copper had established market rates. But municipal records from multiple cities show copper being sold at fractions of those values, sometimes 20% below market, sometimes 30%. These weren't distressed sales. These were government transactions, routine business. But the economics made no sense. The same municipalities documenting these below-market copper sales would then purchase new copper for other projects at full market rates, sometimes in the same fiscal year. That's backwards. That's not how you run profitable operations. So I started pulling more data, building records, archive indexes, municipal accounts, and the pattern became undeniable. Building after building across France, Germany, Austria, Russia. Copper being removed from roofs, domes, spires, decorative work. The documentation varies, sometimes listed as salvage, sometimes as requisition, sometimes with no explanation at all. But the removals cluster in this specific period, 1865 to 1895, 30 years. And here's what makes it extraordinary. These are governments that documented everything. Municipal archives from this period contained purchase orders for nails, for paint, for the candles used during night construction, but tens of thousands of tons of copper, removed from the most prominent buildings in Europe's capitals. The destination records are vague, often missing entirely. The paper trail stops at removed and doesn't continue to delivered to or purchased by or smelted at. That's unusual. That's not how 19th century bureaucracy functioned. Let me walk you through the timeline because timing is crucial. 1844, telegraph technology becomes commercially viable. Copper wire demand begins. 1860s, the architectural removals start. Not small projects, massive works. Val de Grâce Church in Paris. Records show copper roof completely stripped. 1865. Berlin's Französischer Dom. Municipal accounts document copper removal and sale, 1867. Copenhagen's Vor Frelsers Kirke. Building records note spire copper taken down, 1868. Now, the conventional explanation is straightforward. Industrialization created unprecedented copper demand. Old decorative uses were seen as wasteful. And that's partially true. Global copper consumption did increase dramatically between 1850 and 1900. The first transatlantic telegraph cable, laid in 1866, used 2,500 miles of copper wire, weighed over 2,000 tons. Urban electrification begins in the 1880s. Edison's Pearl Street Station opens in 1882. By 1890, cities across Europe and America are installing electrical grids. All of this genuinely required copper. So industrial demand explains part of the story, but it doesn't explain the timing. The copper removal wave starts in the 1860s, 20 years before widespread electrification. Telegraph demand exists, yes, but the scale is wrong. A single cathedral dome contains more copper than 50 miles of telegraph wire, and it doesn't explain the economics. Records show copper being sold at scrap value, then municipalities purchasing new copper at full price for other projects. Same year, same city. That's not economic efficiency. That's something else. St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg is extraordinarily well documented. Construction took 40 years, 1818 to 1858. The French architect Auguste de Montferrand designed it with an elaborate copper dome. The dome was successfully installed. It functioned without issue for 5 years. Maintenance records from this period show no structural problems. In 1863, government orders mandate its removal. The listed reason: excessive structural weight poses long-term stability concerns. But here's the problem. If weight was genuinely an issue, there would have been measurable stress. Settling, cracking, some indication of structural distress. The maintenance logs show nothing. The building was sound, yet they removed approximately 100 tons of copper and replaced it with wood covered in gold leaf. Think about that logic. They claimed the copper was too heavy, so they removed it, and then spent a fortune gilding the wooden replacement to look like copper. That's not structural engineering. That's aesthetic preservation of something they destroyed for non-structural reasons. The Pantheon in Paris has similar documentation problems. Original construction plans from 1757 specified elaborate copper dome work. The architect Jacques-Germain Soufflot designed it with copper as both decorative and structural. Construction took decades. The copper elements were installed throughout the 1780s and 90s. By 1810, most of it was gone. Authorization records from 1807 list the reason as state financial necessity. France was at war. Napoleon's campaigns required metal. That makes sense as explanation, except the removed copper wasn't sent to armories or mints. Napoleon's administration documented everything with extraordinary precision. Supply chains, requisitions, distributions, all meticulously recorded. But the Pantheon copper? The trail stops at removed for state use. No record of which state use, no delivery destination, no smelting receipt. And 5 years later, in 1812, the same government commissioned new copper work for the Arc de Triomphe, paid full market rates. So they couldn't afford to keep copper on the Pantheon in 1807, but could afford new copper for monuments just 5 years later. The timeline doesn't support financial necessity as the real reason. The Royal Palace in Berlin presents another puzzle. Original plans from 1845 specify extensive copper work. Construction proceeds over 15 years, copper included as designed. 1867, most of the copper is removed. Official explanation: reallocation of state resources. But ledger entries reveal the copper wasn't sold to industrial buyers. It was transferred to state reserves. No monetary transaction, no immediate reuse, just moved into government storage. 20 years later, in 1889, some of that copper, identifiable by inventory markings, is sold to a private architectural firm in Munich. So it wasn't urgently needed for telegraph wires or industrial development. It sat in warehouses for 2 decades. Why remove it in the first place? The Hamburg Kunsthalle is even stranger. Brand new building. Construction completes in 1872. Copper roof and decorative elements installed to specification. 1 year later, scaffolding goes up. They remove the copper. The building is 1 year old. Replacement material is zinc, which requires repainting every 8 years to prevent corrosion. Copper requires virtually no maintenance. They replaced a permanent material with one that creates recurring costs on a building barely 12 months old. The authorization document cites compliance with new material regulations. But searches through German legal archives from 1872 to 1873 reveal no such regulations. No law restricting architectural copper was passed during this period. The regulation being referenced doesn't appear to exist. Multiple similar cases exist across Germany, Austria, and France. Official documents citing directives or regulations that cannot be located in legal records. Someone needed bureaucratic justification, so they invented it. Notre Dame has its own peculiar history. The cathedral's copper roofwork dated to the 13th century. 600 years of continuous maintenance. During the 1790s revolution, some was removed for ammunition. That's well documented, but systematic removal happens later. 1860s through 1890s. The architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc oversaw restoration. His plans specifically called for preserving original copper. His private correspondence, archived at the Bibliothèque Nationale, expresses frustration about this. Letters mention being overruled on materials at every turn. He writes to a colleague in 1875 that copper work he specified is denied, not for cost, but by ministerial insistence. He doesn't explain why, just that his architectural decisions are being overridden by political authority. And the copper disappears. Sacré-Cœur in Paris adds another layer. Construction begins in 1875. Original plans, preserved in the Archives Nationales, specify extensive copper work. By completion in 1914, almost none of that copper is present. The substitutions start around 1887. Mid-construction. Amendment documents show material specifications revised per ministerial directive. No explanation, no cost analysis, just remove the copper. The photographic record of this period is extensive. Photography becomes commercially viable in the 1840s. By the 1860s, architectural photography is common across Europe. Thousands of images from this era survive in archives. Professional documentation, careful composition, high-quality work. And when you examine these photographs chronologically, you can track the copper disappearing. The Berlin Cathedral was photographed repeatedly between 1865 and 1905. Multiple photographers, multiple angles spanning 40 years. Early photographs show the dome gleaming. The copper catches light distinctively. The patina creates blue-green coloration where oxidation occurred. Photographs from the 1870s show the same copper work still present. By the 1880s, scaffolding appears in some images, covering sections of the dome. Photographs from 1890 show the copper gone, replaced with dull grey material, probably zinc or painted iron. By 1905, the building's character has fundamentally changed. What was once luminous and distinctive is now just grey stone with a grey dome. This photographic sequence repeats across dozens of buildings. Notre Dame was documented extensively from the 1850s onward. Early photographs show copper roofwork clearly, rich coloration, distinctive patina. By the 1890s, most of it's absent, replaced with lead that photographs as flat grey. St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, same pattern. Photographs from 1860 show the brilliant copper dome. Later photographs show wooden replacement. The photographic evidence is unambiguous. This happened. It's documented visually across multiple cities, multiple decades. And here's what's remarkable. Contemporary sources barely mention it. Newspapers occasionally note renovation work or modernization projects. But there's virtually no public discussion about systematic copper removal. No debate. No architectural journals questioning whether stripping copper from centuries-old buildings is wise. It happens quietly, systematically. What's also notable, while we have photographs of removal in progress, scaffolding, workers, staged materials, we don't have photographs showing where the copper went next. No images of copper arriving at smelting facilities. No documentation of transport to industrial buyers. No records of the state reserves mentioned in written documents. The visual trail ends at removal, like someone carefully documented taking it down, but made sure nobody documented the destination. There's another dimension that connects everything. The buildings losing their copper weren't random structures. They were guild-built, guild-maintained, cathedral guilds, master craftsman guilds, organizations that had overseen these buildings for centuries. And during the same period copper is being removed, 1860s through 1890s, these guilds are being forcibly disbanded. Understanding guilds is crucial here. They weren't just labor organizations, they were knowledge repositories. Technical information passed down through centuries, apprentice to journeyman to master. A master stonemason didn't just know technique. He knew why certain stones were placed in specific positions, why certain geometric patterns mattered, why buildings were oriented particular ways, and crucially, why copper was placed in specific configurations. This knowledge wasn't written in architectural manuals. It was demonstrated, taught through hands-on work, generation after generation. Between 1865 and 1900, hundreds of guilds across Europe were dissolved. The Worshipful Company of Masons in London, dissolved by Parliamentary Act 1875. The Vienna Stonemasons Guild, legally terminated 1871. The Paris Compagnons du Devoir, stripped of official recognition 1884. The Hamburg Baugenossenschaft, forcibly disbanded 1878. All of them, same 30-year window as the copper removals. Official justification: outdated medieval institutions incompatible with modern industrial economy. But these guilds had adapted to new technologies. They were training workers in steam power, modern materials, contemporary construction methods. What they were also maintaining was old knowledge. Knowledge about why buildings had been designed certain ways. Why specific materials mattered in specific configurations. When the guilds dissolved, that knowledge died. By 1900, the new generation of architects and engineers didn't understand why copper had been used so extensively. They saw decoration, expensive ornamentation that could be replaced cheaply. They didn't know what they were removing because the people who understood it had been eliminated from the profession. Vienna's Stephansdom, St. Stephen's Cathedral, illustrates this perfectly. The same guild had maintained it for over 400 years. generations of master craftsmen passing down specific procedures. 1871. The guild is dissolved. New management takes over. By 1873, they're removing copper elements. The new managers don't understand their purpose, so they're seen as wasteful decoration. An architect named Friedrich von Schmidt protests. He'd studied historical construction methods extensively. He writes to city administration that removing these copper elements will compromise the building's atmospheric stability. Nobody understands the term. Atmospheric stability doesn't appear in contemporary engineering manuals, but it appears repeatedly in old guild documents, always in reference to copperwork. Schmidt's protests are ignored. The copper is removed. Within 5 years, sections of the roof show unusual deterioration. Stone that had been stable for centuries suddenly experiencing accelerated erosion. The new team doesn't connect this to copper removal. They attribute it to normal aging. But the guild would have known. They would have understood something about how copper protected the stone. Not from rain, that's what lead does, but from something else. Something the new engineers didn't have words for because the knowledge system that defined it was gone. Russian archives contain extraordinarily detailed documentation of this process. After the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks created comprehensive inventories of everything nationalized. Churches, palaces, estates, everything catalogued with precision. The metal inventories are revealing. Gold gets listed by weight and purity. Silver the same. Bronze by composition, tin percentage, zinc content. But copper from architectural elements gets its own classification system. Not just copper, not just weight and purity. The inventories note atmospheric exposure duration, geometric configuration, installation height above ground level, orientation relative to cardinal directions. Why would any of that matter for scrap metal? If copper is copper, if the only value is raw material, those specifications are irrelevant. But if different configurations had different functional purposes, if copper exposed to atmosphere for a century had different properties, if installation height and orientation mattered, then those specifications would be critical information. The Soviet inventory system suggests they understood these elements had value beyond simple metal content. Between 1918 and 1930, Soviet records document removal of copper elements from over 800 churches. Official justification: elimination of religious infrastructure incompatible with socialist development. But they didn't destroy the buildings. Most remained standing, converted to other uses. They removed the copper, specifically the copper. Other metals often remained. Gold leaf, silver candlesticks, bronze bells, much stayed in place. But copper from domes, spires, copper chains running through walls, systematically removed. A 1923 document is particularly interesting. A Soviet Engineering Committee report discussing atmospheric elements on religious structures. Atmospheric elements is unusual terminology. It doesn't appear in other Soviet construction documents, but it appears in this one report about removing copper from churches. The report doesn't explain what makes these elements atmospheric, just refers to them that way consistently. As if the writers understood these weren't merely decorative or structural, they served some atmospheric function. The report recommends complete removal and centralized storage. Not smelting. Not immediate industrial reuse. Storage. For what purpose? The document doesn't say. But extensive copper from church domes did end up in centralized facilities. Warehouses in Moscow and Leningrad. Some of this copper was still in those warehouses in 1941 when Germany invaded. 20 years in storage. Never smelted, never repurposed. Just kept. Why? Now I need to discuss a theory that exists around all of this. I'm not telling you it's true. I'm not claiming I believe it. But understanding this theory is necessary to understand why this topic matters to so many researchers. There's a growing community, alternative historians, architectural investigators, people examining the same archives I've been describing, who propose something beyond conventional industrial recycling. They propose that 19th century buildings, particularly those from the early 1800s and before, were designed with functional copper elements. Not decorative, functional. The theory goes like this. Copper is the second best electrical conductor after silver. These buildings had copper domes, spires, chains, gutters, downspouts, all positioned to interact with atmosphere. We know copper and atmospheric electricity interact. Benjamin Franklin demonstrated this in 1752. But this theory suggests something more sophisticated, that these elements were designed to harvest atmospheric electrical charge, that copper domes were collectors, that spires functioned as antennae, that decorative elements were actually functional components in distributed electrical systems, and that in the 1860s, as industry moved towards centralized electrical generation, Edison, Westinghouse, the grid model, there was deliberate effort to remove this alternative system. Not because it didn't work, because it worked without anyone profiting. Let me be clear, I cannot prove this theory, but I can show you what researchers cite. Architectural plans for buildings like the Pantheon show copper chains running from domes down through structures to deep foundation points, 40 feet underground. Lightning protection doesn't require that depth. A few feet of grounding suffices. So why elaborate underground copper conductor systems? The copper chains often had ceramic or porcelain separators at regular intervals, insulators breaking continuous copper connection. Why insulate a lightning rod? The whole point is continuous conductivity. Unless you're not discharging lightning, unless you're creating controlled resistance. Specific impedance characteristics. Copper finials, decorative pointed elements on roof peaks, often had internal hollow chambers. Contemporary metalwork didn't usually feature hollow elements. Solid metal was cheaper. But if you're creating specific resonant frequencies, hollow chambers of particular dimensions would matter. Geometric patterns in copper roofwork weren't random. Multiple buildings show the same mathematical ratios, specific angles, particular spacing. Some researchers have analyzed these patterns and found they correspond to wavelength calculations, as if copperwork was designed to interact with specific frequencies. I can't verify these calculations personally. That requires electrical engineering expertise. But the consistency across buildings designed by different architects in different countries suggests shared principles. Principles not documented in any architectural manual we have access to today, because the guilds that understood these principles were dissolved. And the copper that demonstrated them was removed. The Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg is striking. Original plans show copper elements arranged across the roof in patterns that, when viewed from above, resemble modern phased array antenna designs. Researchers who've mapped the spacing found it corresponds to wavelengths in extremely low frequency range, below 300 Hz. That's where natural atmospheric electrical phenomena occur. Lightning generates ELF waves. Earth's magnetic field oscillates in this range. If you wanted to harvest energy from natural phenomena, you'd design collectors tuned to these frequencies. The Kazan Cathedral's copperwork, before removal, was apparently tuned to approximately 7.83 Hz. That's the Schumann resonance, the fundamental frequency at which Earth's atmosphere resonates. Coincidence? The alternative theory says no, says this was deliberate, that buildings were constructed as resonant cavities tuned to natural Earth frequencies, that they were harvesting energy from the planet's electromagnetic field. Again, I cannot prove this, but the copper arrangement at Kazan Cathedral was completely removed between 1886 and 1889. Official reason: structural modernization. The building structure wasn't modified in any other way, just the copper removed. If purely decorative, why was removal considered structural modernization? Unless the structure itself was understood as more than stone and metal. Unless copper performed some structural function the new engineers didn't understand. Records describing these removals use revealing language. French public works documents from late 1860s reference technical complications with existing copper elements on civic structures. This is before electrical infrastructure, before Edison, before urban electrification. What technical complications are being anticipated? Prussian administrative documents from early 1870s discuss atmospheric elements when describing copper removal from churches. That phrasing is unusual. It doesn't appear in other construction documentation. Why is architectural copper specifically described as atmospheric? British parliamentary records from 1875 include brief debate about conductive material management in public buildings. One MP asks whether accumulation of conductive elements in civic architecture poses interference concerns for planned telegraph infrastructure. Another responds that coordination with relevant technical authorities is addressing this. The exchange is brief, few sentences in hundreds of pages, but it suggests government-level awareness that architectural copper might interfere with something. Soviet records classifying seized church property list most metals by type: gold, silver, bronze. But architectural copper from church domes gets separate classification, listed as technical copper. What made architectural copper technically distinct? Why separate categorization if it's all just raw material? The language patterns are consistent across countries, decades, governments. The copper isn't described as decorative or ornamental. It's described functionally: conductive elements, atmospheric elements, technical copper. Language suggesting these components were understood as doing something, and whatever they were doing, multiple governments decided it needed removal. A French Ministry of Public Works memo from 1869 is particularly explicit. It discusses copper removal from government buildings. The relevant section states, "The continued presence of conductive elements on civic structures poses technical complications for planned electrical infrastructure development." Technical complications for infrastructure that doesn't exist yet. Paris's first electrical power station opens in 1887, 18 years after this memo. So what complications are they anticipating in 1869 for technology they won't implement until the 1880s? Unless they already knew how existing copper elements would interact with electrical systems. Unless they knew that interaction would be problematic. Unless they knew the architectural copper was already doing something with electricity. And that would interfere with their plans. Let me separate provable facts from interpretation. Documentable facts. 1. Large-scale removal of architectural copper occurred between approximately 1865 and 1895. Documented through architectural records, municipal accounts, building archives. This happened. 2. The removals often involved financial loss. Copper sold below market value, replaced with materials costing as much or more. Economic decisions don't align with profit or cost saving. 3. Destination documentation is frequently missing or vague. For quantities of copper removed from major buildings, the trail of where it went is surprisingly incomplete. 4. Official justifications often reference directives or regulations that cannot be located. Documents cite authority that doesn't appear to exist in legal archives. 5. Timing precedes the industrial infrastructure supposedly requiring this copper. Systematic removals begin 2 decades before widespread electrification. 6. Guild organizations maintaining these buildings were forcibly disbanded during the same period. Hundreds of craftsman guilds dissolved between 1865 and 1895. 7. The removal process was systematic and coordinated across borders. Similar patterns in multiple countries during the same window suggests coordination. Those are facts, documented, verifiable. Everything else, theories about atmospheric energy, suppressed technology, hidden networks, that's interpretation. I can't prove those interpretations correct, but I also can't explain the facts without acknowledging something unusual happened. Conventional explanation, industrial demand, modernization, pragmatism, accounts for some of this, but not financial losses on transactions, missing destination records, non-existent regulations cited, timing before the supposed demand, systematic coordination across governments, simultaneous guild dismantling, technical language suggesting functional understanding. Something beyond simple industrial recycling occurred. Multiple governments coordinated something during this 30-year window. They documented it vaguely. They obscured destinations. They invented justifications. That pattern suggests intent. Intent beyond recovering scrap metal. If these buildings used copper for more than decoration or structure, if there was functional purpose the guilds understood but didn't document, then what was removed wasn't just material. It was knowledge. Architectural knowledge about designing structures that interact with atmospheric phenomena. Engineering knowledge about conductive materials and geometric arrangements. Technical knowledge developed over centuries. All irretrievable now. We can see buildings. We can measure them. We can analyze remaining materials. But we can't see how they functioned because functional components are gone. It's examining a clock after someone removed the gears. You can see craftsmanship. You can see it's beautifully made. You can see where gears used to be. But you can't know what time it told. And maybe that was intentional. If you want to control electrical distribution, you need dependent customers. If buildings can harvest their own power, you have a population that doesn't need your grid, that doesn't buy your electricity, that doesn't depend on infrastructure you control and profit from. So you remove the capability, not with prohibition, not with force, just with renovation, modernization, progress. Strip the copper, replace it cheaper, file paperwork as routine maintenance. Within one generation, nobody remembers buildings functioned differently. Knowledge dies with craftsmen. The new generation sees copper domes as decoration, because by the time they question it, functional copper is already gone. What strikes me most isn't what I found, it's what's absent. Copper removal from hundreds of major European buildings isn't discussed in standard architectural history. Not taught in architecture schools, not analyzed in academic literature about industrialization or urbanization. Just not there. Like someone collectively decided this wasn't interesting to study. Or maybe too interesting. Thousands of tons of architectural copper disappeared from Europe's most important buildings in 30 years. Someone coordinated that across governments and borders. Someone documented it with vague language referencing regulations that don't exist. Someone removed destination records so we can't trace where it went. Someone dismantled the guild system that maintained these buildings and understood their construction. Someone made sure that a century and a half later, architectural historians don't discuss it. I can't tell you this was conspiracy to suppress free energy technology. I can't prove these buildings were functional electrical systems. But I can tell you the official explanation doesn't fit the evidence. And the evidence suggests something valuable was deliberately taken. Whether that something was expensive metal, or whether it was knowledge, that remains open. The copper is gone. Buildings remain, hollow where they used to gleam. The guilds are dissolved, the technical knowledge is dead, and nobody's talking about it. Why did they strip copper from every cathedral, every palace, every civic building across Europe in the same narrow window? Why did they dismantle organizations that maintained these buildings and understood their construction? Why do economic records show losses instead of gains? Why do destination records stop at removed for state use without explaining which use? Why don't architectural historians study this? I don't have those answers, but I know the pattern exists, and patterns this consistent across countries, decades, governments, don't happen by accident. Someone knew what they were doing, someone had a reason, and someone decided we shouldn't know what it was. The copper went somewhere, someone knows where, they just decided you shouldn't. Every old cathedral is evidence. Evidence that something was there that isn't anymore. Something that mattered enough to remove systematically. Something that mattered enough to obscure the records. Something that mattered enough to make sure the people who understood it couldn't pass that understanding forward. The buildings remember, even if we don't. They remember being complete. They remember when copper caught the light. They remember when they functioned as something more than just stone and wood and glass. And maybe, if we pay attention to what was taken, we can remember too.